A routine flight turns tense. The hum of the jet engines filled the first-class cabin with a soothing white noise, wrapping its passengers in the cocoon of luxury that came with premium travel. The soft lighting, spacious seating, and personal service were all hallmarks of an experience designed for comfort. Among the passengers seated in the plush leather seats of first class were Otis and Evelyn Bennett. Otis, a tall, distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair, sat reading a hardcover book. He adjusted his glasses occasionally, engrossed in the text. Evelyn, his wife of over 40 years, sat beside him, elegantly dressed in a tailored navy suit and a silk scarf draped across her shoulders. She scrolled through her tablet, occasionally glancing out of the window at the vast expanse of sky stretching beyond the wing of the plane. This flight was supposed to be just like any other, a quiet, comfortable journey. They had flown first class countless times before, and despite their wealth and success, they never saw themselves as above anyone else. They had earned their place in the world through hard work, resilience, and an unwavering belief in treating people with respect. But not everyone saw them that way. Heather Connors had been a flight attendant for nearly a decade. She had worked her way up through the ranks, proving herself to be capable, professional, and dedicated. She prided herself on maintaining order and ensuring that all passengers followed the airline's rules. As she moved through the first-class cabin, her keen eyes swept across the passengers. She had developed a sixth sense for spotting anomalies, passengers who didn't belong, who had somehow ended up where they shouldn't be. It wasn't about race, she told herself. It was about maintaining the integrity of first class. But when her eyes landed on Otis and Evelyn Bennett, something about them made her pause. The way they sat, so comfortably, so at ease, it struck her as odd. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about them, but something in her gut told her to check. She walked up to their seats, placing a firm hand on the armrest of Otis's chair. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "May I see your tickets?" Otis looked up, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. He reached into his blazer pocket and retrieved two neatly folded boarding passes. Without hesitation, he handed them over. Heather took the tickets and scanned them quickly, her brows knit together. They looked legitimate, but something still didn't sit right with her. "These must be a mistake," she said, shaking her head. "First class is reserved for paying passengers." Evelyn's eyes darkened, but her voice remained steady. "We paid for these seats." Heather barely heard her. She was already reaching for her service tablet, preparing to cross-check their names against the passenger manifest. As she did, a ripple of unease spread through the surrounding seats. Other passengers glanced over, sensing tension. She tapped furiously on the screen, searching for their names. Nothing. Her heart quickened. She looked up, her expression sharpening. "I'm going to need you both to step aside while I verify this with the front desk." Otis and Evelyn exchanged a glance. This wasn't the first time they had experienced something like this, but it never got easier. "And why?" Evelyn asked, her voice smooth as glass. "Should we need to move when our tickets are right there in your hand?" Heather's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just standard protocol," she replied, but there was a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "Standard protocol," Otis repeated, his voice calm but firm. He placed his book down on the tray table. "For whom?" Heather's patience thinned. She knew better than to let a passenger question her authority. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to call security." More passengers turned their heads now, openly watching the exchange. Some pretended not to notice, staring straight ahead or pretending to be immersed in their in-flight entertainment. But a few looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Heather, feeling the pressure of the stairs, straightened her posture. She had to maintain control of this situation. Otis exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He had seen this pattern before. A quiet, everyday moment turning into something much bigger. And all because someone refused to believe he and his wife belonged. At the front of the cabin, Senior flight attendant David Langley was speaking in hushed tones with another crew member when Heather approached. "I have a situation in first class," she announced, keeping her voice low but firm. David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of situation?" Heather crossed her arms. "Two passengers who shouldn't be there." David frowned. "Did you check the manifest?" "I don't need to. I can tell." She barely noticed the flicker of concern in David's eyes. He had seen this before, though it was rare for it to unfold so openly. Still, Heather wasn't backing down. "I need security to verify their seats," she said, reaching for the intercom to call for assistance. David hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. But before he could say anything, Heather had already made the call. Minutes later, Officer Mark Grayson, a uniformed security officer, entered the first-class cabin. His presence sent a ripple of discomfort through the passengers. Heather stepped aside, arms folded across her chest, watching as he approached Otis and Evelyn's seats. Mark cleared his throat. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to clear up a seating issue." Otis adjusted his reading glasses and leaned back slightly. "A seating issue." His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "Our tickets are right here." Mark glanced at Heather, who gave him a silent nod. He hesitated. He had been in security long enough to know when he was being pulled into something that wasn't quite right. Evelyn, who had remained quiet up until now, spoke again. "We are elderly," she said, her voice controlled. "You are asking us to stand up, gather our things, and walk to the front of the plane because this woman refuses to believe we belong here." Mark shifted uncomfortably. He glanced around the cabin. Passengers were watching now, some wide-eyed, others trying to disappear into their seats. Heather let out an impatient sigh. "It's a simple request," she said. "If there's no mistake, they can come back to their seats after verification." Otis exhaled slowly. He had no intention of getting up. He turned his gaze to Mark, speaking in a voice that left no room for doubt. "Son, before you make a decision you regret, you might want to call your supervisor." Mark blinked. "His supervisor?" Heather scoffed, rolling her eyes. "This is getting ridiculous." Mark hesitated. Something about Otis's words sent a warning through his gut. He tapped his radio. "This is Officer Grayson requesting clearance to remove two first-class passengers. Can I get verification on their status?" Static filled the line for a moment. Then a voice crackled through. "Do not remove those passengers. Repeat, do not remove those passengers under any circumstances. We're sending someone to handle this." Mark's head snapped up. Heather's arms dropped to her sides. "What do you mean, do not remove them?" Mark turned toward the couple, his expression shifting from firm to cautious. He studied them again, as if seeing them for the first time. Otis met his gaze steadily. Evelyn simply smoothed her scarf, her expression unreadable. Heather felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. Then movement at the front of the plane caught everyone's attention. A tall man in a sharp navy suit stepped into the cabin, his presence commanding instant respect. Nathan Calloway, the airline's regional director, had just boarded the plane. And the moment he saw Otis and Evelyn, his face changed. Heather felt her breath hitch. Because the way he looked at them, she realized, too late, that she had made a terrible mistake. A moment of reckoning. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was no longer one of quiet luxury. It had shifted into something taut and uneasy, a kind of silence that held weight. Passengers sat stiffly in their seats, eyes darting between the flight attendants and the security officer. Some tried to appear uninterested, but it was impossible to ignore the scene unfolding before them. At the center of it all, Otis and Evelyn Bennett remained seated, their calmness a stark contrast to the tension humming around them. Otis had placed his reading glasses back on, scanning his book with an almost deliberate ease, while Evelyn rested her hands on her lap, her fingers tapping softly against the fabric of her tailored pants. Meanwhile, Heather Connors stood frozen, her face pale as Nathan Calloway strode down the aisle, his navy blue suit crisp, his steps controlled. He wasn't moving with anger, but with a precision that made Heather's stomach tighten. She had been so sure of herself moments ago, so certain that she was handling a situation correctly. But now the energy had shifted completely, and Heather suddenly felt like she was standing on the wrong side of something much bigger than she had anticipated. The unraveling begins. Nathan stopped at the front of the first-class cabin, his gaze moving over the passengers, the crew, the security officer, and then finally settling on Otis and Evelyn. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. Nathan had worked for the airline for years, but this was not the kind of situation he had ever expected to walk into. He turned to Mark Grayson, the security officer, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Officer Grayson," he said, "what's the issue here?" Mark hesitated, his training kicking in, but there was uncertainty in his stance now. "Mr. Calloway, I was called to assist with a seating verification issue." Nathan's gaze sharpened. A seating verification issue. Heather stepped forward, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Yes, I noticed that these two passengers." She gestured toward Otis and Evelyn without using their names. "We're in first class, and their presence seemed questionable. I asked to verify their tickets, and when they refused to cooperate, I escalated." Otis chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. But he said nothing. Nathan's expression darkened. "Questionable." Heather swallowed. "Yes, sir. I was just following policy." "What policy?" Nathan cut her off. His voice wasn't raised, but the authority in it was impossible to ignore. Heather faltered. Well, first-class seating is reserved for verified ticket holders, and I had reason to believe." "What reason?" Nathan interrupted again, his patience visibly thinning. Heather opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was no real reason. No logical, defensible reason for why she had singled out this particular couple. No reason at all. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, her grip tightening on the service tablet in her hands. Nathan didn't need an answer. He had already figured it out. Instead of pressing her further, he turned toward Otis and Evelyn, his voice shifting into something much more measured, much more respectful. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, I sincerely apologize for this situation." Evelyn gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Otis didn't look up from his book. "Oh, and what situation would that be?" Nathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It seems there was a misunderstanding regarding your seating arrangements." Otis exhaled, setting his book aside and removing his glasses. He met Nathan's gaze evenly. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone carrying just the right amount of disbelief. "Interesting." Heather felt her stomach churn. The realization sets in. Nathan straightened, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned back to Heather. "Miss Connors," he said, his voice now clipped and professional, "I assume you checked the manifest before making the call to security." Heather hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides. She knew what he was asking, and she also knew that everyone in the cabin, the passengers, the crew, security, was waiting for her response. She forced herself to nod, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have." Nathan's lips pressed into a tight line. "But you didn't." Heather didn't respond. Because she didn't need to. Nathan inhaled sharply through his nose. "Do you have any idea who these people are?" Heather's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say that she had made a simple mistake, that she had merely been ensuring the integrity of the flight. But the way Nathan was looking at her made it clear that she couldn't spin her way out of this. Before she could say anything, Evelyn's voice cut through the silence. "She doesn't know," she said, her tone smooth but cutting. "She didn't bother to find out." Heather's breath hitched. The murmur of first-class passengers grew louder. A few exchanged glances. Some already had their suspicions. Nathan took a slow step back, giving Otis and Evelyn space. He turned slightly, ensuring the entire first-class cabin could hear him. "Allow me to clarify," he said, his voice steady. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet aren't just first-class passengers. He paused for emphasis, letting the weight of his next words settle before he spoke. They owned this airline. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Heather's world tilted. She felt her knees go weak. Her vision blurred for a split second. Otis and Evelyn Bennet, the owners. She stared at them, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't quite process what she had just heard. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a mistake. Heather had worked for this airline for nearly a decade. She knew the executives, she knew the policies, she knew the names of the board members. But never once had she connected them, this quiet, composed elderly couple, to the very top of the company. She felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. And from the way Nathan was watching her, she knew, without a doubt, that she had just destroyed her entire career. The weight of consequences. Otis sighed, shaking his head slightly. Imagine that, he said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. Kicked off our own flight. Evelyn adjusted her scarf, her expression unreadable. Such a shame, she murmured. All these years in service, and she still doesn't know who signs her paycheck. Heather felt something tighten in her chest. Nathan exhaled through his nose. Miss Connors, he said, his tone now carrying the finality of a verdict. You are officially relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Heather's head snapped up. Wait, I. Nathan held up a hand. Enough. Mark Grayson, the security officer, took a step closer. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone made it clear. Heather was no longer in control. Passengers were still whispering. Some openly stared at her. Others avoided eye contact. Heather clenched her jaw, struggling to keep her breathing steady. She wanted to defend herself, to justify her actions, to plead. But she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't just a mistake. It had been a choice. And now she was facing the consequences. Nathan turned toward Mark. Escort Miss Connors to the crew area. Upon landing, she will be met by airline officials for further disciplinary action. Heather's breath hitched. Wait, disciplinary action. Nathan's gaze hardened. Indefinite suspension. Pending termination. Heather's vision blurred again. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't fair. She had been following policy. She had been doing her job. Hadn't she? Otis leaned back in his seat, picking up his book again. Evelyn, meanwhile, gave Heather one final glance. I do hope, she said, you learned something from this. Heather swallowed hard. Because for the first time in her entire career, she wasn't sure she would. The fall from power. Heather Connors had never felt powerless before. For nearly a decade, she had worked as a flight attendant, climbing the ranks, earning the respect of her colleagues, and priding herself on her ability to command order in the cabin. She had trained under some of the best, taken additional leadership courses, and had even been considered for a promotion to senior flight supervisor. But none of that mattered now. Not when she stood frozen in the first-class cabin, her mind reeling from the words she had just heard. They owned this airline. It felt like a slap to the face, a punch to the gut. Heather's world tilted as the truth sank in. The elderly couple she had just humiliated, accused of sneaking into first class, and called security on, weren't just passengers. They were her bosses. And from the way the entire first-class cabin was now staring at her, she wasn't sure if she'd ever step on a plane again. A power shift in the cabin. Nathan Calloway, the airline's regional director, stood firm, his gaze locked onto her with a look of controlled disappointment. It was the kind of expression that told her he wasn't angry, he was simply done. Miss Connors, Nathan said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. You are officially relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Heather opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She glanced around, searching for some kind of support, but there was none. Her fellow flight attendant, David Langley, looked away, his expression unreadable. Security officer Mark Grayson stood ready, shifting slightly as if preparing to escort her from the cabin. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, and a few outright stared, their eyes filled with either disbelief or judgment. Heather swallowed hard, gripping the hem of her Navy uniform. "Sir, Nathan held up a hand, cutting her off. Enough. Just like that. The words died in her throat. She had spent her entire career giving orders, expecting people to listen, expecting them to respect her. Now she was the one being dismissed, and there was nothing she could do about it. The walk of shame. "Officer Grayson, please escort Miss Connors to the galley," Nathan instructed. "Upon landing, she will be met by airline officials for further disciplinary action." Heather felt her breath catch. Disciplinary action. This wasn't just about being removed from duty for a single flight. This was bigger. A sinking realization settled in her stomach. They were preparing to fire her. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. Passengers continued to murmur, their quiet voices buzzing like static in her ears. She wanted to snap at them, to tell them to mind their own business, to fix this. But how could she? She had already lost control. Security Officer Mark Grayson stepped forward, his voice low and neutral. "Miss Connors, please come with me." Heather felt the walls closing in. Her body refused to move at first, but she forced herself to put one foot in front of the other. The aisle had never felt longer. She could feel the stairs burning into her back as she walked past rows of wealthy travelers, people she had spent years catering to, making sure they were comfortable, enforcing the very policies that had now become her undoing. She heard a quiet scoff from one of the passengers, a businessman who had been watching the confrontation unfold. Another passenger, a young mother with a child on her lap, muttered under her breath, "Well, that backfired." Heather's jaw clenched, but she kept walking. It wasn't until she reached the galley that she realized she had been holding her breath. An empty space, a heavy reality. The galley was small, lined with metal cabinets, coffee pots, and storage compartments. It was supposed to be a space of order, efficiency, and professionalism, a place where flight attendants worked together seamlessly. Now it felt like a holding cell. Heather stood stiffly, arms wrapped around herself, as if to shield against the cold weight of humiliation pressing against her. David Langley stepped into the galley, his expression unreadable. She exhaled sharply. "David, you have to back me up here." David sighed, crossing his arms. "Back you up on what, Heather?" She blinked. "I was doing my job." David arched an eyebrow. "Were you?" Heather stiffened. "I was following protocol," she insisted. David shook his head. "No, you weren't. You skipped every step of protocol and went straight to calling security. You assumed they didn't belong. And now," he gestured vaguely toward the cabin, "now you're paying for it." Heather's stomach churned. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that she had simply been trying to uphold the rules. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down she knew. He was right. She had assumed, and that assumption had cost her everything. The silence before the storm. The rest of the flight passed in unbearable silence. Heather remained in the galley, away from the passengers, away from the first-class cabin where Otis and Evelyn Bennett still sat, unbothered, sipping tea. Nathan Calloway had left her with a final warning before walking away. "When we land, HR will be waiting for you. I suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say." Heather had never dreaded landing before. But today, it felt like she was descending toward the end of everything she had worked for. As the plane began its final descent, she stared at her trembling hands, the perfectly pressed sleeves of her uniform now feeling suffocating against her skin. Her mind raced. Was there a way out of this? Could she fix it? Could she convince them that this was just a misunderstanding? She thought about the apology she had given in the first-class cabin. "I assumed you didn't belong in first class." The words had burned coming out of her mouth. But even then, she knew they weren't enough. Because if Otis and Evelyn hadn't been the owners of the airline, if they had just been regular passengers, Would she still be apologizing? The answer sat in her stomach like a stone. No, she wouldn't have. And that realization hit harder than anything else. The plane's wheels touched the runway with a smooth but final thud. The flight was over. And so, she feared, was her career. A fate sealed. The cabin door swung open, and passengers began to disembark. Heather stayed where she was, her back pressed against the cold galley wall. She could hear Nathan Calloway speaking with someone outside the aircraft. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was coming for her. Her breath hitched. Then a voice. Calm, powerful, and completely unshaken. Otis Bennett. "Miss Connors," he said smoothly, stepping into the galley. Heather lifted her gaze, her stomach twisting into knots. Otis adjusted his cuffs, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Evelyn stood poised, her scarf still perfectly in place, as if the entire flight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "We'll see you at corporate headquarters tomorrow morning," Otis said simply. Heather felt her pulse spike. Tomorrow morning. Evelyn gave her a small, knowing smile. "You didn't think this was over, did you?" Heather's stomach dropped. She had thought, hoped, that this humiliation would end the moment she stepped off the plane. But it seemed her real reckoning was only just beginning. The meeting that would decide everything. The airport's corporate headquarters was a towering glass structure, sleek and imposing, reflecting the early morning light like a monolith. Heather Connors had walked into this building dozens of times before, her confidence unshakable, her uniform crisp, her head held high. Today, however, she walked through those sliding glass doors as a woman on trial. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a professional smile, barely looked at her before pressing a button on her intercom. "Miss Connors is here," the receptionist said, her voice even. A pause. Then a voice crackled through the speaker. "Send her up." Heather's stomach twisted. She forced herself to nod and stepped into the elevator, watching as the doors slid shut. The polished metal reflected her face back at her, a face that looked far less composed than usual. Her normally pristine uniform was immaculate as always, but today it felt more like a costume than a badge of authority. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the executive floor. When the doors opened, she stepped into a corridor lined with glass offices, each space occupied by figures in crisp suits and designer attire. She recognized some of them: executives, board members, people who had once smiled at her during holiday parties. None of them smiled now. A heavy wooden door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Beyond that door, her fate awaited. The executives who held her career in their hands. The conference room was larger than she expected. A long glass table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The room smelled of expensive coffee and fresh paper, the scent of power and decision-making. Seated at the head of the table were Otis and Evelyn Bennett. Otis was flipping through a thick file, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression unreadable. Evelyn sat beside him, her posture relaxed yet poised, stirring a cup of tea with an air of quiet command. Nathan Calloway was also present, his arms crossed, his gaze sharp. Two other board members sat on either side of the table, their expressions neutral but assessing. Heather felt her throat tighten as she stepped inside. Nathan gestured toward the lone chair positioned at the far end of the table, the hot seat. "Sit." Heather obeyed, her back rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their slight trembling. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to maintain some shred of dignity. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched long enough for her heartbeat to sound deafening in her own ears. Then Otis finally closed the file in front of him. He looked up. "Miss Connors," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something she couldn't quite decipher. "Do you know why you're here?" Heather swallowed. "Yes, sir." Otis exhaled, adjusting his watch. "Then tell me, in your own words, Why did you do what you did? Heather's chest tightened. This was it. The moment she had spent the entire night preparing for. Her defense. Her chance to fix this. She straightened slightly. Sir, she began carefully, I was simply following protocol. As a flight attendant, it's my responsibility to ensure that first-class seating is reserved for ticketed passengers. And Otis raised a hand. Heather froze mid-sentence. Miss Connors, he said, his tone losing the calm edge it had before. We all know the policies. We also know that you didn't follow them. Heather's pulse spiked. She opened her mouth to argue, but Evelyn spoke before she could. You never checked the passenger manifest, Evelyn said, stirring her tea slowly, her eyes never leaving Heather's. Heather tensed. You never verified the names against the system, Evelyn continued. Heather's nails dug into her palms. You never called the gate crew to confirm. Nathan leaned forward. And let's not forget, you called security before you even spoke to a supervisor. Tell me, Miss Connors, how exactly was that following protocol? Heather's breath hitched. She felt like the walls were closing in. Her carefully rehearsed defense was crumbling before she could even get the words out. She should have known. She wasn't dealing with irritated passengers. She was dealing with owners, with leaders, with people who had spent decades running a business and could spot lies before they were even spoken. Otis sighed, leaning back in his chair. Let's drop the excuses, he said plainly. Tell us the truth. Heather's pulse pounded in her ears. She had two choices. She could keep lying, keep pretending that she had been the victim of a misunderstanding, or she could admit the truth that had been gnawing at her since she stepped off that plane. The weight of an admission. Heather inhaled sharply. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I assumed. Silence. A heavy, deafening silence. Heather's fingers clenched in her lap. She swallowed past the tightness in her throat and forced herself to keep going. I assumed you didn't belong in first class, she admitted, her voice hoarse. Evelyn set her teaspoon down gently on her saucer, the soft clink of metal against porcelain sounding final. Nathan's gaze remained unreadable. Otis exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. Heather kept going, unable to stop now. I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify your tickets. I just looked at you and decided you weren't supposed to be there. Her words hung in the air, thick with tension. Otis studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. That's the first honest thing you've said all morning. Heather's breath hitched. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her gaze still piercing. And if we weren't the owners, she asked smoothly, would you be sitting in this room? Would you even be apologizing? Heather's stomach twisted. She wanted to say yes, but she couldn't. Because the truth was no. If Otis and Evelyn had just been ordinary passengers, wealthy but unknown, she never would have been forced to answer for what she had done. She would have brushed off the complaints, maybe gotten a small reprimand, and moved on. The realization burned. Evelyn nodded slightly, as if she could see the exact moment the truth fully settled into Heather's mind. That's what I thought. Nathan leaned forward. So tell me, Miss Connors, if we let you walk out of here with your job intact, what exactly are you going to do differently? Heather opened her mouth. No answer came, because she didn't know. She had spent the last 10 years of her career believing she was in control, that she was right. But now, she wasn't sure she even knew who she was anymore. Otis sighed, glancing at Nathan. Then he stood. Well, I think that settles that. Heather's stomach dropped. Was this it? Was she about to be fired? She braced herself for the final blow. But then Otis did something unexpected. He extended his hand toward her. Heather blinked, her breath catching in her throat. This is your chance, Otis said simply. To learn, to change, to be better. Heather stared at him, stunned. This wasn't what she had expected. She had expected punishment. But this was a choice. her choice. And suddenly, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she realized. What she did next would define the rest of her life. A choice that would define her. Heather Connors had spent her entire career believing she was in control, that she was the one enforcing rules, ensuring order, maintaining professionalism. But in this moment, standing in the boardroom of the very airline she had spent a decade serving, staring at the outstretched hand of Otis Bennett, one of its owners, she had never felt less in control. Everything she had built, the reputation she had crafted, the authority she had wielded in the cabin, it was all gone. And now, Otis Bennett was offering her something she never expected. A choice. Would she take his hand? Would she admit to herself, fully admit, that she had been wrong? Or would she let her pride dictate her future? Heather swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She wanted to reach out. She wanted to grab onto whatever slim chance this was, whatever lesson she was supposed to learn. But her pride, her stubborn, unshakable pride, kept her frozen. Her fingers twitched. Then she hesitated. The road to redemption or ruin. Otis sighed, retracting his hand after a few moments of silence. He didn't look disappointed. He didn't even look surprised. And that made it worse. "You're not ready yet," he said simply, smoothing the front of his suit as he stepped back. Heather's chest tightened. "Not ready," she repeated, the words escaping before she could stop them. Evelyn, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange, finally spoke. "Not ready to face the truth about yourself," she said smoothly, lifting her teacup with an elegance that made Heather feel even smaller. Heather clenched her jaw. "I admitted I was wrong." Nathan Calloway, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, finally leaned forward. "Yes, you admitted it," he said. "But do you believe it?" Heather stiffened. Nathan cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "Do you believe it?" he repeated, sharper this time. Heather opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down, she didn't know. Had she truly learned from this? Or was she just saying what they wanted to hear? Evelyn set down her cup gently, the soft clink echoing through the silent boardroom. "Let me tell you something, Miss Connors," she said, tilting her head slightly. "People like you, people who wield power without understanding the way of it, are the most dangerous kind." Heather's breath hitched. "You assume," Evelyn continued. "You judge, you make decisions that impact others, and you do it without questioning why. But now, you're the one being judged." Heather felt her throat tighten. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "And you don't like it, do you?" Heather swallowed. Hard. She didn't. She hated it. For so long, she had been the one in charge, the one controlling the narrative, the one determining who stayed and who was removed. But now she was at their mercy, and she didn't know how to handle it. The reality of consequences. Otis glanced at Nathan. "I think we've heard enough." Heather's stomach twisted. "No, wait," she blurted out. Evelyn raised a perfectly arched brow. "Wait for what?" Heather's breathing grew unsteady. She shook her head. "I don't know." Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Connors, let me be clear about where we stand right now." Heather sat up straighter, bracing herself. "You have two options," he continued. Heather's pulse quickened. "One," Nathan said, holding up a single finger. "You walk out of here today, jobless. Your employment with this airline will be terminated immediately. No severance, no recommendation, nothing." Heather's stomach plummeted. "Or two," Nathan continued, lifting a second finger. "You step back. You take a mandatory leave of absence. You enroll in a company-sponsored training program designed to help employees, especially those in leadership roles, unlearn their biases and reshape the way they approach their jobs." Heather's jaw tensed. "Bias training." Nathan's gaze sharpened. "You don't like that, do you?" Heather hesitated. Of course she didn't. She had always believed she was fair, that she treated everyone the same. But this situation, her actions on that flight, had proven otherwise. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. "Let me ask you a question, Miss Connors." Heather forced herself to meet her gaze. "If we had been a different kind of couple, if we had been younger, or dressed differently, or had skin that looked more like yours," Evelyn tilted her head slightly, "would you have treated us the same way?" Heather felt like she had been punched. The answer was obvious, and it hurt. Evelyn's expression didn't change. "That's why you need the training." Heather exhaled shakily. "And if I refuse?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "Then you're finished." Heather's heart pounded. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had spent years being the one in control. Now, for the first time, she had to choose whether she was willing to change. She wanted to fight back. She wanted to argue. She wanted to cling to what little power she had left. But deep down, deep down, she knew they were right. She needed this. She needed to see what she had refused to see before. She needed to be better. The moment of truth. Heather inhaled sharply. Then, for the first time in the entire meeting, she let go of her pride. She nodded. "I'll do it." Evelyn studied her carefully, looking for any hint of insincerity. Otis leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Nathan gave a single, approving nod. "Good." Heather exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. She had never felt this exhausted. Otis stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your leave of absence begins immediately. You will not step onto another plane as a flight attendant until the training is completed." Heather nodded again. Nathan slid a file across the table. "Your program begins next week. Review the details carefully." Heather picked up the folder, gripping it tightly. For the first time since the incident, she felt something shift inside her. Not relief. Not humiliation. Something else. Something new. Maybe this was the end of the version of herself she had always known. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. She stood, smoothing down her uniform, her fingers lingering on the fabric. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the person she used to be. The beginning of a new path. Heather Connors had walked through the airport's corporate headquarters countless times before, but today felt different. She wasn't walking in with confidence, her polished uniform a symbol of authority. She wasn't walking in to enforce policies or oversee passengers. She was walking in as a student of change, a student of her own undoing. The folder Nathan Calloway had given her was clutched tightly in her hands, its contents weighing heavier than she had anticipated. Bias training, leadership retraining, customer relations workshops. The list went on. It wasn't just about learning how to be a better flight attendant. It was about unlearning everything that had made her fail. And that was what terrified her the most. A new kind of first day. Heather arrived at the training center early. The building was nothing like the corporate offices she was used to. There were no gleaming glass walls, no high-end furnishings, no silent halls filled with suits making six-figure decisions. Instead, it was a simple, well-lit space filled with chairs arranged in circles. A projector screen stood at the front, and on the walls were framed posters with words like empathy, respect, and diversity printed in bold letters. A small group of people had already gathered inside. Some were dressed in flight crew uniforms, others in customer service attire. A few wore casual clothes, their expressions unreadable. Heather hesitated at the entrance. Then, an older woman with soft gray curls and warm brown eyes stepped forward. She wore a neatly pressed blazer and had the kind of presence that demanded respect without asking for it. "You must be Heather," she said, offering her hand. Heather took it automatically. "I'm Elaine Morrison," the woman continued. "I run this training program." Heather cleared her throat. "It's nice to meet you." Elaine gave her a knowing smile, the kind that suggested she already knew why Heather was here. "Come on in," she said. "Find a seat. We'll get started soon." Heather nodded, walking into the room with stiff shoulders. She felt like every pair of eyes was on her. And maybe they were. After all, her story had already spread throughout the airline. Facing the mirror, Elaine started the session with a simple question. "What does power mean to you?" The room was silent for a moment. A young flight attendant with auburn hair shifted in her seat before speaking. "For me, power is about control," she said, "making sure everything runs smoothly, keeping order." A middle-aged man, a customer service manager, nodded. "I'd say power is about authority, setting expectations, making sure rules are followed." Heather stayed quiet, listening. Elaine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Those are interesting answers," she said, "and not entirely wrong. But let me ask you this. Who gives you that power?" The young flight attendant frowned. "The airline does." Elaine tilted her head. "Does it?" The room fell silent again. Heather's fingers curled in her lap. She thought back to her time on that flight. How certain she had been that she was in control, that she had the power to remove anyone she deemed unworthy of first class. But in the end, she had been powerless. Her authority had crumbled the moment she realized the truth. Otis and Evelyn Bennett had never been beneath her. They had never needed her permission to be there. She had simply assumed, and in that assumption, she had lost everything. Elaine's gaze landed on her. "Heather," she said gently, "what do you think power is?" Heather's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, waiting. And for the first time, she let herself answer honestly. "I used to think power was about control," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "About making sure people followed the rules. About enforcing order." Elaine nodded. "And now?" Heather exhaled, her hands tightening into fists before relaxing again. "Now." She hesitated. Then, "Now, I think real power isn't about control. It's about responsibility." Elaine's eyes softened. "Go on." Heather swallowed. "I had power on that flight," she admitted. "But I didn't use it responsibly. I used it to make someone feel small, to make myself feel bigger." She looked down at her lap, her voice dropping lower. "And it cost me everything." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elaine smiled, a knowing, approving smile. "That," she said, "is the first step toward real leadership, the hardest lesson yet." The training sessions continued over the following weeks. Heather was forced to confront things she had never questioned before. How unconscious biases shaped decision-making, how authority could be abused, how power had to be wielded with care. She sat through role-playing exercises where she had to experience what it felt like to be on the other side of authority. She listened to passengers' real stories, stories of discrimination, of humiliation, of being treated as less than simply because someone assumed. And each time, the same sickening feeling twisted in her gut. Because she had been that person to someone else. She had been the one making the assumptions. She had been the one who needed to change. One day, Elaine pulled her aside after class. "You're making progress," Elaine said. "But I need to ask, do you want to come back?" Heather hesitated. "Come back?" Elaine nodded. "Do you want to return to the airline?" Heather had asked herself that same question every night since the incident. At first, she thought the answer was obvious. Of course she wanted her job back. But now she wasn't sure. The woman she had been before, the version of herself who walked through first class, assuming she knew everything. Was not someone she wanted to be again. And if she couldn't be better, then what was the point? Heather exhaled slowly. "I don't know," she admitted. Elaine smiled. "That's a good answer. It means you're thinking." A meeting that was different this time. 3 months later, Heather found herself back at the airline's corporate headquarters. This time, she wasn't being summoned for punishment. She had requested this meeting herself. Otis and Evelyn Bennett sat at the same long glass table, just as they had before. Nathan Calloway was beside them, watching carefully. Heather sat across from them, her posture straighter, her hand steady. This time, she wasn't here to beg for her job back. She was here to own what she had done, and to decide if she was ready to return. Otis studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Tell us, Miss Connors," he said. "What have you learned?" Heather took a deep breath. She wasn't the same person who had walked off that plane 3 months ago. And now, she was ready to prove it.